Hello. Today I want to talk about the background and emergence of what we can term the Gestaltist movement within psychology. I will talk about the later development of the movement and its impact on modern conceptions of perception and thinking in separate videos. As with all the videos in this series, our textbook is Morton Hunt's The Story of Psychology, and students should read the relevant chapter in that book for further details. As a movement within psychology, the Gestaltist perspective effectively began in 1910 in the meeting of three young psychologists who became the prime movers of the developing paradigm. The Gestaltist approach was rooted in existing philosophical and psychological objections to the prevailing Wundtian approach to psychology, some of which I have already described in my video on alternatives to the Wundtian paradigm in the German-speaking world. I will give you the link in the notes below the video. Briefly, in establishing psychology as a distinct academic discipline, Wundt had introduced a sharp distinction between the experimental study of immediate experience, phenomena such as reaction times to stimuli on the one hand, and all higher order aspects of mental life, including memory, intentionality and judgment on the other. For Wundt, only the former formed part of natural science, Naturwissenschaft, and could be examined experimentally. The latter was merely Geistwissenschaft, a science of the spirit, more akin to speculative philosophy than real science. Although Wundt's approach was fully in keeping with the mechanistic philosophy which then prevailed in German science, many of the more philosophically inclined psychologists were dissatisfied with the resultant neglect of elements of human mental life which they regarded as important. This was not necessarily mere nostalgia for the more metaphysical and mentalist approach which was now deemed unscientific and passé. Rather, for a significant number of psychologists, Wundtian psychology was barren and confining because it did not deal with complex forms of experience, such as the emotions, thinking, learning, and creativity, which they regarded as being the most important aspects of human life. There was also a growing body of specific research evidence that perceptions were not identical with sensations, but were the mind's interpretation of that data. Thus, as early as 1890, the Austrian philosopher Christian von Ehrenfels had pointed out that when a musical melody is transposed, every note is changed, yet we hear the same melody. This is true both when a passage of music is played at a higher octave and when it is played on a different instrument, a piano rather than a violin, for example. We recognize the sameness of relations among the parts of the whole, its form and quality, Gestalt Qualität, with our minds rather than our ears. Again, in 1897, the Austrian physicist Ernst Mach noted that we perceive a circle as a circle, even though at certain angles it may actually appear as an ellipse. Similarly, we see a table as a table, whatever the angle we view it from. That is, the mind does more than merely receive sensory data, but rather interprets it in terms of what it knows the object to be. Later, in 1906, the Italian psychologist Vittorio Benussi found that he could not get his subjects to ignore the whole figure when he asked them to look at the horizontal lines in the famous Muller-Lyer illusion, in which a horizontal line bounded by inward-pointed arrow heads looks longer than the same line bounded by outward-pointing arrowheads. The subject could understand that the illusion made them see falsely, but not eliminate its effects from their perception. Again, around 1910, David Katz, G. E. Muller's research assistant at Göttingen, explored the phenomena of brightness and of color constancy. These refer to the common experiences in which we see an object as having the same brightness and color, even when it's in shadow rather than in the sunlight, and is thus objectively different. That is, we see within a known context and in accord with what our mind's understanding is, rather than simple sensory data. Gestaltism effectively began in 1910. The story is well known. Max Wertheimer, a young psychology researcher from the University of Vienna, was on a train speeding through Germany en route to the Rhineland for a vacation. Noting the familiar illusion of different buildings and hills moving along with the train, he wondered why this was. This in turn led him to think how the stroboscope worked. This was a then popular toy which used a succession of similar pictures seen through a slitted wheel to create the impression of movement. A horse that at the right speed could be made to trot, a boy to walk, and so on. Many children today, and I assume also in Wertheimer's time, are similarly familiar with this illusion when they draw a succession of images on the corners of the pages of their notebooks and see apparent movement when they flick through them. This was also the same technique used in the early movies, of course, with a succession of frames of film creating the impression of movement. But the early movie makers, from the 1890s onwards, had not understood what caused the effect. Struck by the peculiarity of the stroboscope experience, Wertheimer resolved to understand how the impression of continuous motion from non-moving images was created. It occurred to him that the illusion of motion might be due to something in the mind rather than the retina. Was there some higher-level mental process which supplied transitions between successive pictures? To begin his research, Wertheimer got off the train at Frankfurt to consult with one of his former teachers, Friedrich Schumann, who was an expert on perception. When he arrived, he bought a toy stroboscope to experiment with, replacing the existing pictures, the horse that could trot, the boy that could walk, with drawings of lines in two parallel locations. By spinning the stroboscope at different speeds, he found that these lines could be made to appear, to alternate, or coexist, or become a single line moving from one position to the other. Consulting with Schumann, Wertheimer found that his former teacher could not explain the phenomenon. Schumann offered Wertheimer laboratory space to do further research, however, as well as the use of a new tachistoscope, a more precise and controlled way of viewing and timing images which appeared to change. Wertheimer abandoned his holiday plans and instead spent the next half year in Frankfurt engaged in research. Wertheimer was also introduced to Schumann's two research assistants, Kurt Kofka and Wolfgang Kohler. Kofka and Kohler were both then in their early 20s, and Wertheimer a few years older, and the three young men quickly became friends. The trio found that they all shared an interest in the higher-level mental phenomena ignored by Wundt. All three were also at various times involved in research on higher mental functions. Wertheimer on the thinking of feeble-minded children, Kofka on rhythmic Gestalten, and Kohler on the psychology of acoustics. Unsurprisingly, they found the Wundtian approach too narrow and confining. Again, they were influenced by the Würzburg School of Psychology, where Wertheimer and Kofka had both studied, where a handful of psychologists had rejected Wundtian principles and had used introspection to explore conscious thinking. And philosophically, they were all influenced by the phenomenology of Karl Stumpf and the idea that the primary materials of research are everyday real-life experiences, not elemental sensations and feelings. As we will see in the other 4 videos for this lecture, the Gestaltist perspective, which Wertheimer, Kofka and Kohler developed, combined a philosophical mentalism with a strict regard for experimental evidence. It was based on demonstrations and experimental evidence rather than the rationalist arguments and metaphysical speculations of the earlier mentalist psychological thinkers. Thank you.